Good morning everyone, and thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrew Murray and I work for the Risk Management Implementation Unit here at ECHA. Downstream users have a key role in advancing the safe use of chemicals. Their tasks include implementing safe use of their own site and communicating relevant information both to their suppliers and to their customers, as well as to ECHA. So, if you are a downstream user, this webinar will update you on recent developments to help you use chemicals safely and fulfill your duties under the REACH regulation. Today's agenda should be visible on your screens. We will start with the presentation on how downstream users can benefit from the latest work done to improve information flow in the supply chain. After this, my colleague, Bridget Ginnity, will talk to you about how to prepare a downstream user chemical safety report, and she will be followed by Faisal Mushtaq, who will describe how you can notify ECHA on authorised uses. Bridget will then conclude with the last presentation to give you an overview of the information and awareness raising material available for downstream users. We encourage you to submit your questions at any time through the question and answer panel, which should be visible in your webinar window. If you want to focus on the presentations, you can also send us your questions during the 30 minutes following the end of the event. Our panelists will answer as many of them as possible directly through the question and answer panel. Please try to submit questions related to the webinar topics and do not include any confidential business information. If your question is not answered by the end of the webinar, you can send it to us using our contact form. If you wish to ask anything more specific, or if your question contains confidential business information, you can send them using our contact form. If you experience any difficulties with the webinar tool, you can contact our technical support team through the question and answer panel or by email. The information is visible on your screens. So, let's move on to our first topic, where I will explain the latest developments designed to improve information within the supply chain. In this presentation, I will cover the following topics. First, a vision on how information in the supply chain can work. Then, the tools that will help effective supply chain communication, providing you with details on what's available now and in the near future. After that, I shall talk about current developments on mixtures. Then, I'll give some details on sources of information on chemicals, in particular, finding information on chemicals on ECHA's webpage, its databases, and a preview of two new tools being made for the dissemination webpage, the substance info card and the brief profile. Finally, I'll leave you with some useful links to sources of information. To start with, let's look at how the chemical supply chain and how the flow of information on the safe use of substances under REACH regulation works. We can think of the information flow as a loop between two main actors, the manufacturers and suppliers who place substances on the market, and downstream users. For this presentation, we concentrate on two types of downstream users. End users, those companies that purchase substances to use directly in their processes or activities, and formulators, the companies that mix substances together to produce mixtures. These mixtures are then supplied to their customers, who might be other end users, retailers, or even consumers. You'll notice from this slide that formulators appear in both the up and down directions of the supply chain. Formulators have a key role to play in the communication flow in the supply chain. We'll return to this role in a moment. So, who prepares and provides which information in the supply chain? The registrant of a substance is obliged to prepare the registration dossier, and for substances that are manufactured or imported in more than 10 tonnes per year, this includes the chemical safety report. The registrant is required to assess the use of the substance throughout its life cycle. Therefore, as a first step, he needs to gather information on the uses of his substance in the supply chain, for example from his downstream customers. The registration dossier and the chemical safety report document the conditions of safe use. Exposure scenarios describe the conditions of safe use for a specific use or group of uses. The chemical safety report is submitted to ECHA, while the safety data sheet, which should contain information which is consistent with the chemical safety report, is the vehicle to communicate information on safe use to customers. Safety data sheets may have exposure scenarios attached to them. These exposure scenarios for communication should concentrate on describing in a clear manner the operational conditions and risk management measures which result in the safe use of that substance. The use of standard formats and phrases is recommended in exposure scenarios. Let's now look at communicating uses to the registrant. Downstream users have the right to inform a registrant about their uses of a substance in order to have them included in the registrant's chemical safety report. The registrant may, however, decide not to take them on board. If you have new information on the hazards of the substances you use, or you consider that the risk management measures in the safety data sheet you receive are inappropriate, you must communicate this information back to your supplier. Earlier, I mentioned that formulators have a key role in communication flow in the supply chain. To recap, formulators produce mixtures which are then supplied downstream. Paints, lubricants, adhesives are all examples of mixtures. And formulators are one category of downstream user under the REACH regulations and the Classification, Labelling and Packaging regulation, which deals with the classification, packaging and labelling of substances and mixtures. Formulators receive from their suppliers the safety data sheets and exposure scenarios for the substances they use to prepare mixtures. When they supply their mixtures further downstream, those mixtures, if hazardous, must be accompanied by information in the form of a safety data sheet. Let's now take a closer look at the left-hand side of this information flow, the upstream communication. I said that downstream users have the right to inform a registrant about their uses of a substance in order to have them included in the registrant's chemical safety report. Use maps are one means by which a formulator can provide structured information on the substances they use in their mixtures. This information flow is most efficiently managed by sector associations, and several are developing use maps to cover typical uses and conditions of use in their sector. Contact your sector association to find out if they have a use map that you can take advantage of, or if they intend to prepare one. It is important to act as soon as possible if any of the substances you use are likely to be registered by your suppliers at the next REACH registration deadline in 2018. When there is a need to inform a registrant about your own use directly, harmonised templates should be used in order to standardise the communication flow. Use maps can still help to do this. Now, let's switch to the downstream communication between the registrant and downstream user and look at the first step in the communication flow between the registrant or supplier and the downstream formulator. As I explained before, the information consists of the safety data sheet and exposure scenarios. There is a harmonised format for the exposure scenario that is now being widely adopted by industry. To make the supply of exposure scenarios between a supplier and their customers downstream more efficient and consistent, there is a package called ESCOM, which stands for Exposure Scenarios for Communication. This contains the software standard so that the supplier and downstream user IT systems can exchange information, and a catalogue of standard phrases. The use of standard phrases in exposure scenarios means less variability in the information received from different suppliers, and that the information becomes more relevant and understandable. Finally, let's look at what the formulator can provide to his customers. To do their work effectively, formulators need to receive clear information from their suppliers. Experience so far has indicated that formulators can receive different information from different suppliers, in particular in the formats utilised to convey information on safe use of a substance, the uses of a substance, concentration and risk management advice. From this wide range of material, formulators need to identify the relevant information to communicate on how to use their mixtures safely. For instance, the operational conditions of exposure duration, frequency, concentration and so on, as well as the risk management measures that need to be applied. Approaches are being developed to help formulators in this task so that they can provide the information to end users on how to use their mixtures safely. In the next slides, I'll mention two approaches. The bottom-up method takes the existing information on conditions of safe use for the mixture, which are known to the formulator, as the basis for the safe use information for the mixture. These are then cross-checked against the exposure scenarios of the substances received from the supplier. Generally, bottom-up methods are sector-specific, and they aim to provide pragmatic and easily understandable information to end users. The form of this information is known as Safe Use of Mixtures Information and abbreviated to the term SUMI. SUMIs have a harmonised template and use clear language, pictograms and are written in sector terminology. An example of a template for a SUMI is shown in the next slide. The downstream users of Chemicals Coordination Group, or DUC, an organisation which consists of a number of sector associations that formulate mixtures, have agreed on a format for a SUMI with mandatory and optional parts. Here you see an example of the mandatory parts. It provides a general description of the process covered by the SUMI, the operational conditions under which the mixture can be used in safety, and the risk management measures that need to be applied. The optional elements may only be relevant for certain sectors and might give sector-specific advice as well as additional product information. The SUMI would be supplied with the safety data sheet for the mixture. Let's now look at the second approach, the top-down approach. This slide illustrates the main characteristics of the top-down method. Here, the safe use information for the mixture is derived by consolidating information from the exposure scenarios of the most hazardous substances, often called the lead components. This information is adjusted, taking into account the concentrations of the lead components in the mixture, and used to then identify the operational conditions and risk management measures for the mixture's use. The outcome, that is the safe use information for the mixture, still needs to be cross-checked against the exposure scenarios of the substances. This lead component identification methodology is currently under development and being tested by a number of industry sectors. Generally, top-down methods are widely applicable regardless of uses and mixture compositions. The tools and methods I've described so far, sector use maps, safe use mixtures information, the ESCOM package, a table of contents for the safety data sheet, are all products that have been produced or are now being developed as part of an initiative involving ECHA, industry and member state authorities called the Chemical Safety Report and Exposure Scenario Roadmap. This is often shortened to the term CSR-ES Roadmap. There is also a network called the Exchange Network on Exposure Scenarios that works to identify and share good practice to help registrants and downstream users improve the information communicated in the supply chain. More information on these initiatives is given at the end of this presentation. Let's now turn to looking at some of the important information sources that are available to you as a downstream user. There is a wealth of information on substances available to you on ECHA's website, so I shall spend a few minutes explaining what information is likely to be most relevant to you and provide some screenshots taken from ECHA's webpage on the databases and links to illustrate where that information can be found. As a downstream user, you may want to find information on the hazard classification of the substances you use or may use in future. What are the uses that the substance has been registered for, and if the substance is likely to be restricted or banned due to its hazardous properties. You can search ECHA's database for individual substances. Here you see information retrieved from the substance benzene. The database then allows you to access different sources of information, for example, on registered substances or the classification and labelling inventory, where more specific information can be found. As you can see, the two databases mentioned before on registered substances and the classification and labelling inventory currently contain information on many thousands of substances. In addition, there are separate databases that contain information on substances that may be subject to authorisation or restrictions under REACH, as well as other legal frameworks such as biocides. This information can be accessed by clicking on the web link shown. One development that is new in 2015 is the so-called Substance Info Card. This info card captures the essential information about a substance drawn from ECHA's databases. As you can read, it provides information on a substance's critical properties, its classification and labelling, its uses, and the precautions to take when handling it. A second new development are the so-called brief profiles for substances. As you can read, these profiles contain more extended information on the substance, its classifications and labelling, as well as its scientific properties and toxicology. Substance info cards and brief profiles will become available on ECHA's dissemination webpage by the end of 2015 or early 2016. They do not replace the safety datasheet or exposure scenarios that you receive as a downstream user from your supplier. But you may find such info cards useful in your organisations if you need to explain to your workers or customers information about substances you use, or if you want to find out information on alternative substances. So, I'm coming to the end of my presentation on information in the supply chain. Before ending, I'd like to summarise what you've heard and how information from the REACH regulation and CLP regulation can help chemicals be used more safely. Firstly, on exposure scenarios, improvements are being made in their content, format and automation. Second, for formulators. Formulators are playing a vital role in communicating the relevant information in an understandable way. Thirdly, the quality of the information in the supply chain relies heavily on the exchange of information between downstream user and the registrant. What goes up comes down. It pays to provide your supplier with comprehensive information on how you use substances. And finally, a lot of information is available on ECHA's webpage to help you manage environmental, health and safety activities on chemicals in your organisations. If you want to find out more about the activities, methods and tools I've mentioned, you can find out more at these links. Thank you for your attention. I hope you found the presentation useful. I now give the floor to my colleague Bridget Ginnity, who will talk about the different approaches for preparing a downstream user chemical safety report. Bridget, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Andrew, and good morning and welcome. Andrew described how exposure scenarios are generated. And then as a downstream user, you have to check these exposure scenarios that you receive from your supplier. You first of all check that your use is covered in the exposure scenario, and if you're a formulator and you pass it on towards customers, you also need to check that your customer use is covered. You check that the actual conditions match your actual conditions, and then depending on the outcome, you'll take whatever action is necessary. If your use or your conditions of use are not covered in your supplier exposure scenario, you have a number of options. And one of these options is to perform a downstream user chemical safety report. So in this talk, I'll describe how you can go about preparing such a report. But first of all, what is a downstream user report? It's a report of the chemical safety assessment for the substance and for the use that's not covered in the exposure scenario from your supplier. So it's really a narrow enough focus. Some of you might be a bit nervous. You may have come across registrant CSRs and see how big a task that is. But really it's not as extensive as a registrant chemical safety report. You will not be overwhelmed by it. If you're an environmental health and safety professional, you're probably more used to doing chemical safety assessments in the workplace or for the environment, and it's more similar to what you would do there. In that way, you would use your hazard assessment from your safety data sheets, and in the same way, for a downstream user CSR, you would also use the hazard assessment of the registrant that you receive. We have in the last month published a practical guide on how to prepare a downstream user CSR. And this guide was developed together with other stakeholders under the leadership of a DUC, that's the Downstream User Chemicals Coordination Group. And so the group together discussed how best to go about it and described a few different approaches to it. But first of all, no matter what approach you take, before you start, there are some initial things. One, and the most important, is to check, do you have to do it at all? There are some exemptions that may apply, such as, is the use relatively low? Is it less than 1 ton per year? Is the substance quite low? For example, is it below the cutoff for the mixture classification? So, and there are a number of other conditions as well. So perhaps you should first of all check if it's required. And then also you need to consider what the alternatives are. It's not the only option when your use isn't covered. You may be able to contact your supplier and ask them to cover your use, or you could implement the measures. Maybe those that are recommended are suitable for your site. And the initial step is that you would gather the substance and the hazard information. By that I mean things like the exposure limit values, the substance properties, and again the safety data sheet from your supplier is the primary source for this. And there are a lot of other sources available that you can use. But the main thing is that you're confident that the information is reliable and that it's trustworthy. And of course you need to say where you sourced that information from in the report. So the practical guide describes 3 different approaches to preparing a chemical safety assessment. So I'll describe how you could go about these. First of all, you need to identify the use to be assessed. Then you'll consider, is your use included in the supplier exposure scenario? So if your use is included, the most straightforward approach for you to take we refer to as the supplier exposure scenario, or approach A. So I'll describe the main elements of it now. The first thing is that you base it on the supplier exposure scenario that you have received. You identify which conditions of use are different to those that are in the supplier exposure scenario. And then you estimate the exposure. There's a couple of ways you can do that. You could use the exposure estimation tool that your supplier used, or you could perhaps use a recalculation scaling tool that may be available. Then when you have estimated the exposure, you check that the risk is controlled. And that simply means that you check that your exposure is below the whatever the limit is, and we refer to that as the DNEL for human health, or the PNEC for the environment. So this is very similar to checking the exposure scenario if you use scaling to do this. And it's a relatively straightforward, easy way to do it, and it's fairly low complexity, so it's generally the first choice. And I'll just give you an example of it. Imagine if in your site you have a dipping process, and you receive from your exposure scenario you receive from your supplier an exposure scenario that describes dipping, and it says that the duration is full shift, but it recommends that you have LEV. You go down to your shop floor and you see, yes, you have dipping. The workers are less than 4 hours at the task, but you don't have LEV, you have general ventilation. So while we would describe that your use is covered, but your conditions of use are not covered. So it's an ideal candidate for this approach A supplier exposure scenario. So what you need to do first of all is to calculate you can get from the exposure scenario what the exposure estimate is from your supplier and the RCR, the risk characterization ratio. You then calculate those for your own situation, for the actual circumstance. And that is and in this case we're 2.5 milligrams per meter cubed compared to 10.5 in the actual situation. Now, so then a second approach that you can take is if it happens that your use isn't included, another approach is looking to see if there's a sector exposure scenario available for your use. And if it is, well, then an approach you can take is referred to as the sector exposure scenario, or approach B. Now, the core of this is basing it on an exposure scenario for DUCSRs that sectors have provided. Now, and essentially this is something that's in development by sector organisations, where they have exposure scenarios that describe conditions of use for typical uses in that sector and for substances of typical properties in those uses, and provide exposure estimates for it. So that means that you would first of all identify the exposure scenario that describes your use and conditions of use, and also that the substance properties and the use conditions match those in your own site. You then take the exposure estimate that's provided from the sector and confirm that your risk is controlled. Now, obviously, a generic assessment must be available before you can do this, and these are being developed by sector organisations. So I won't give any more detail on that at this moment. I'd mentioned that there was a third approach. And again, going back to our decision chart, if you have decided that neither approach A nor approach B are suitable to you, you then consider approach C, which is your own exposure scenario. And this in many ways is something that can be applied in all situations. The first step is that you generate your own exposure scenario. And that's no more difficult than simply describing your conditions of use, describing how you use it on site, how long it's used for, what the concentrations are, what risk management measures you have. Then when you have done that, you estimate the exposure. And this is where you could do it again using an exposure estimation tool, but also it would be typical enough that you might have measured data from your regular health and safety monitoring that might be suitable for use. When you have estimated the exposure, again as with all other systems, you check that the risk is controlled. So, as I mentioned, this is very similar to the site-based risk assessments that you do, and is likely to draw on the experience that you have on that. Depending on how complex the assessment is, it may require greater competence than the other approaches, but for a simple situation, it's also a very straightforward approach. I'll just give an example here as to how you might do it if you have measured data. And in this case, I'm showing where you've looked back and you actually show that you have measured data over the last 3 years. And where you would then check what the average are, that you would check that you have enough samples to be representative. You would check that the spread is not too wide, that it's valid to compare and combine the data from a number of years. You'd need to check that the conditions of use are the same as those that you're assessing. And then you determine your risk characterization. In this case, if the DNEL is 25 milligrams per meter cubed, the RCR is what we would take as the 90th percentile, representing the exposure estimate, divided by the DNEL, so that's 0.02. So another alternative would, in this case, would have been to use a model, such as ECHA, TRA, Staff and Manager, the Advanced Reach tool. There are a number of them out there, and also uses for environmental. So before I finish, and before you finish your DUCSR, an important thing to do is document the work. That's essential that you do. There are some different requirements for a DUCSR for REACH processes than you would do for a normal risk assessment that you would perform under the Chemical Agents Directive. So you do need to look and make sure you adhere to those. In many cases, you will have to report to ECHA, so that needs to be done. And then if you're in a situation where you were assessing a use of your customer, you also need to communicate that outcome to the customer if it's relevant to do so. So I'd just like to conclude by saying that a DUCSR is typically within the competence of most environmental health and safety professionals. I hope if you happen to be an environmental health and safety professional and listening to this, you realise that it's the type of work that you would conduct regularly. And then also there are plenty of opportunities of synergy with risk assessment under other environmental and health and safety legislation. The risk assessments that you have done for the environment or for health and safety in the workplace can be used to help you perform your DUCSR. And similarly, both the exposure scenario check and the DUCSR can help to feed into your risk assessment on site to ensure that, to help you to ensure that that is quite a good assessment and that the two work together well. So I'll conclude with that, and then just to say the next speaker is my colleague Faisal Mushtaq, and he will talk about reporting to ECHA for the range of different purposes you may need to report to ECHA as a downstream user, including, of course, the downstream user CSR. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bridget. As Bridget mentioned, I'm going to now talk to you a little bit about where a downstream user either has to report or notify to ECHA. Now, as you see on this slide, there are 4 situations when you might need to notify or report, and they're all linked with legal obligations. Don't worry, I'm not going to go into any detail about the legal obligations, but at least I want you to see where there is a clear legal requirement. Mainly in this presentation, I'm going to talk about authorized uses because they are quite new. And then I'll also give a brief overview of the other reporting and notification obligations. At the bottom of the screen, you can find a link which takes you to the submission page on the ECHA website. And from there, you can do all of these 4 different kinds of submissions. Now, firstly, let's talk about Article 66 on authorized uses. If you are using a substance that is on the authorization list and you have checked that your use is authorized, and what does it mean to notify within 3 months and how to submit that notification? That is what I'm going to explain in the next few slides. Firstly, checking if your substance is on the authorization list. It is already assumed that you know something about authorization. If not, there's a lot of information on the ECHA website. Now, look at the substances that you use and if they are on the authorization list. And as of September 2015, there were 31 substances on there. You need to check whether your substance is there, and you need to know when is the sunset date. This is very important because after this date, you may no longer put on the market or use a substance unless it is covered by an authorization. And there are a number of exemptions from authorization. They are listed in the link here at the bottom of the slide. Now, if your substance is on the list, you need to check if your use is authorized. And you don't necessarily need to apply for your own authorization. Somebody up your supply chain may have done so. But you receive a label and a safety data sheet with your product, and on that label or safety data sheet should be a REACH authorization number in the format shown on the screen. You should also receive an exposure scenario describing the conditions of use. In order to comply with the authorization, you need to comply exactly with those conditions of use. If you are expecting an authorization number and you don't receive one, you should contact your supplier. There may be a reason why he hasn't provided this, or he may even have an alternative for you. What does it mean to notify ECHA within 3 months, and when does that time period start? Basically, it starts from the first delivery of the substance after the publication of the authorization decision in the official journal of the European Union. And from that date, you have 3 months in which to report to ECHA through the web form on ECHA's website. Your customers may also need to notify ECHA, and their time period starts from their first delivery of the substance also. There are some situations where you don't need to notify. Firstly, because you own the application and you are the application holder. Secondly, if you are a distributor who doesn't use the substance, technically you are not a downstream user under REACH, but you do have obligations to pass on information such as the REACH authorization number to your customers. And thirdly, you use the substance as an intermediate or one of the other exemptions that I already mentioned a couple of slides ago. So, how to submit the notification? It's very simple. At the moment, you can only do it via web form on the ECHA website at the following link. You need a REACH IT account, and you need to have activated that REACH IT account. Then you log in and you provide your name, your contact details, and the REACH authorization number. Optionally, you can additionally provide the quantity that you use per year and the number of people on site that may be concerned by the use. Once you have done this and you click submit, you have satisfied the Article 66 notification requirement. Next, we move on to Article 7.2, notification for substances and articles. This applies to importers and producers of articles who have to notify ECHA if candidate list substances are in their articles under certain conditions which are listed on this slide. And those conditions are that the substance is present in more than 0.1% weight, if the substance in total usage is more than 1 ton per year, if there is exposure foreseeable during the article lifetime, or if the substance has not already been registered. You can check the candidates list at the link below, and at the moment there is 163 substances on that list, so please check it regularly as it is updated. You can notify, in this case, via web form or REACH IT, depending on how familiar you are with Euclid. You can find more information at the link at the bottom of this screen. A recent decision from the European Court of Justice deemed that an article used as a component of a complex article remains an article. And this is very important when you're considering what does it mean your 0.1 weight percent. Next, we move on to Article 38, report for unsupported uses. Firstly, what is an unsupported use? And this is a use that is not supported by the exposure scenarios of your supplier. And that means you can discuss with your supplier, and if he agrees to include your use, for example, your use becomes supported. But if you remain in a situation where the exposure scenarios do not consider your use and do not support your use, you must report to ECHA within 6 months of receipt of the safety data sheet with the registration number. And those conditions on which you report are the fact that you have done your own assessment, so you have done a downstream user chemical safety report assessing your use or the use of your customers, or you are claiming an exemption from conducting a downstream user chemical safety report. For example, because you use in total less than 1 ton per year. And the link at the bottom of the screen is where you can report. So again, you can report via web form or REACH IT, and you can find more information there also. Last but not least, we have the Article 38.4 report on classification difference. If you're a downstream user and you have a classification different from that of all your suppliers, you are required to report to ECHA. You may find yourself in different situations. Ideally, you agree with all your suppliers and you don't need to report. As long as you agree with one of your suppliers' classifications, you don't need to report. And there may be a justifiable reason why your suppliers have different classifications, for example, due to impurities. However, if you are in a situation where you don't agree with any of your suppliers, then you do need to report. But first, you should contact your suppliers and discuss it with them. In particular, if you have new information, you have an obligation to pass that information on to your suppliers, and you may actually be able to agree a classification. If not, then you do remain with the obligation to report. There is an exemption from this, and that is if your total quantity of use is less than 1 ton per year. And again, at the link at the bottom of the page is where you can find more information, and then you can report. In this case, there's only one method of reporting, and that is through ReachIT with Euclid. Thank you for your attention. I hope it was clear that you now know that there are 4 situations in which you have to notify or report to ECHA and where you can find more information about them.
Thank you, Faisal, and good morning again. In this talk, I'm going to describe the information that's available to downstream users on the ECHA website and through the ECHA website. I'll describe the support there is, particularly for downstream users, and I'm going to focus on the support that's new and describe how you can go about finding it easily and quickly. Now, obviously the web pages are a key source of information, and we have a number of sections that are of particular interest to downstream users. Obviously we have a downstream user page. We described the formulator page in a previous webinar, and the information of chemicals was described earlier by Andrew. Using chemicals safely at work is a page that's been there for a while, but it makes a lot of links between workplace and other sources of information such as EU, OSHA and unions and so on, trade unions and so on. And then there's also a new section called Getting Started. And this is very much focused at SMEs who aren't so aware of all of their requirements, and it's broader than just downstream users and REACH. It also includes CLP and biocidal products regulation. So this is very much, if you're new to all of this and you're a little bit overwhelmed, this is intended to signpost you in the right direction and to make your life a little bit easier. We also have quite a number of documents that are designed to support the downstream user. Obviously, we have a guidance for downstream user, which describes in quite a lot of detail what the requirements are. And this goes through a rather stringent development process together with other stakeholders from industry and member states. And we also have a nutshell version for a quick entry into it. In a previous talk, I described the newest practical guide that we have on the EU CSR, but we have another of other ones, including one on checking exposure scenarios. Another new document that we have is Chemical Safety in Your Business. Now, this was together with the Enterprise Europe network, and this is a network designed to support small businesses in Europe to deal with a lot of their regulatory needs. And this focuses, again, rather like the Getting Started pages, on the broader regulatory requirements for REACH, CLP and the biocidal product regulation. So it covers a number of different pages and is a very good entry document for a wider viewpoint. Another document we have, which is actually an e-guide or an interactive guide, is on safety data sheets and exposure scenarios. And this guide is very much designed at different levels, both for people who need to know in general terms what a safety data sheet, perhaps people in a purchasing department or in workers on the workplace, but then also for environmental health and safety practitioners who need to know what they should do when they get a safety data sheet and an exposure scenario. I'll just show you a couple of pages from it. This is the contents page, and it shows all the different sections of the safety data sheet and the sections of the exposure scenario. And you can simply click on any of those to go into that section and find more information. For example, if we click on ES2, the second section on exposure scenario, on the conditions of use, you'll find you come to a page like this. And most of the pages are structured in the same way, so that on the right-hand side you see an example of what that section looks like, and then on the left-hand side you can click for further information. The key points describes what you find there in general terms, and again that's more at an entry-level information. A closer look is that detailed description of what you should do with the information. And there are also on every page 4 yellow buttons at the bottom, which give you different sources of information and tools. For example, it is information on the comparison between DNLs and OELs. There's a description of annotated template of exposure scenario to help you understand it, and so on. So I think this is a guide that people I know have been finding very useful so far for a lot of different purposes. And then when you get a safety data sheet, another aspect is that you would actually need to check it and check the quality of it. Now, we have developed a safety data sheet for checklists, and it was actually developed by Forum. Now, the Forum is the group of member states, it's a network of the national enforcement authorities, and their objective is to aim to harmonise how REACH and CLP are enforced. So this checklist was developed together with them, very much from an inspector's point of view, but we have made it public now in order to help recipients and also suppliers of safety data sheets to use it themselves to check the quality. It includes a number of different checklists. One of them is a more general one that's very much site-based. It's asking questions such as, is it in the correct language? Are the risk management measures consistent, and so on. And then there's a very detailed line-by-line checklist where you can go through each section in turn and very much looking to see if it's compliant with what the regulation requires. So this is just new on our website at the moment. Now, another thing which we have come up with in the last year is presentations, and presentations that you can edit. And the reasoning behind this is that in the same way as I'm giving a presentation this morning, a number of you in your job have to give presentations. It could be to employees in the company, it could be to management. If you're a consultant or a sector organisation or an authority, you have lots of reasons to give presentations. So we have taken a number of the key topics. We've taken 5 different areas and prepared presentations for those. And these are slides, presentations as PowerPoint. You can take any number of the slides that you want. I'll give you an idea of what they look like. So you can see these are just a slide from each of those presentations. So we've tried to make them fairly graphic without too much text in it. You can take it, you can modify it, translate it, use one of them, use 10 of them, use all of them. And it also includes notes to help explain a little bit of the background to support you in giving a presentation. So the most recent one was published in September on formulating mixtures for end use, but the full series of 5 is completed now for this year. Also, in another way of making user-friendly information very much at the entry-level point are explainer videos. So these are simply short videos of 2 to 3 minutes which describe, one of them is there describing who is a downstream user, helping you to identify whether you are a downstream user or not. And one that's just published now, this month in fact, is how REACH and CLP affect downstream users. If you haven't seen these before, we'll play them after the final presentation in this webinar. We'll play the 2 of them. And we'll do that in the 30-minute period when you can actually be adding in extra questions that you might have. So just to remind you again that after the presentations, there's another 30 minutes in which you can send in more questions. So this is just a glimpse of some of the information that can be provided. There's also a lot of other material, webinars, templates, questions and answers, and so on. In the presentation that will be on the website, the links, direct links are given to all of these. But we also have another way to help people find the information quickly and easily, and that's an interactive map. So it takes all the main areas of the website for downstream users and provides direct links. So when it's exploded out, it looks like this. So it's a little bit busy at the moment, I'm sure, but certainly it's something that I have up as a favourite on my computer, because I find I can get information very easily. For example, you were listening this morning to Andrew talking about the CSA roadmap and ENAs. You would simply click there. Faisal described reporting to ECHA. Again, you just click on this section there and go directly to the reporting to ECHA section. And I described earlier the DUCSR. Again, the Practical Guide 17 is directly linked from here. I talked earlier about web pages. Again, the links to some of the most interesting web pages for downstream users are given. Here's just some of them that you can just click on these. Another aspect then is general support. I talked about the presentations, Q&A and webinars, and again just highlighting where you can click on whatever information that you want. So if your mind works in this way, it might be a very useful way of you getting the information. So just to conclude, I'd say there are a number of ways to help you to keep up to date. One of them is that we have a downstream user mailing list, and every 2 months or so we send an email just highlighting what is new and what might be of particular interest to downstream users. You can sign up for that after this webinar if you're not already on it. Also, the final slide of each presentation gives the ECHA newsletter and media. It's well worth signing up for those. But your National Health Desk, sector organisations and other competent authority websites and so on, there's an awful lot of support out there, obviously, that's specific to your own country and in your own language, so I'm sure you'll find that very helpful. But we do appreciate your feedback to help us ensure that we're responding to what it is that you need and understanding what additional support you might find and how useful or not useful that you find the support that we provide. So, thank you very much, and I'll hand over now to Andrew to conclude the webinar.
We are reaching the end of the webinar. I hope you found the presentations useful. Remember that you still have 30 minutes to send questions to our panellists. When the webinar closes, you will be automatically redirected to a short satisfaction survey. Your comments and suggestions will help us to further improve our webinars. The webinar will be recorded and published on our website shortly after the event. All registered participants will receive a link to the recording and presentations as soon as they are available. We will also gather the main questions and answers and send them to you shortly after the event. Our next webinar will take place on the 18th of November. This will be the second webinar on the REACH 2018 deadline. The event will focus on how to find co-registrants and how to work together with them. If the REACH 2018 deadline affects you, make sure to register for the webinar in time, since places are limited. We also invite you to share the information with your networks. All details are available in the webinars section of our website. Thank you for joining us, and I hope to see you again in our upcoming webinars.